At first, it was just another morning at the docks. Ezra sipped burnt coffee, Bramble sniffed crates, and the mist rolled in thick over Harbor Point. Nothing unusual until Bramble refused to move past container 12B. Not bark, not growl, just froze. Before we begin this unforgettable story, would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments? And if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move you, please give this video a like and consider subscribing. Harbor Point, Oregon was a place shaped by mist and tide. Mornings came quietly with the ocean's breath rolling ashore and curling between shipping containers like a living thing. In late autumn, the sea air grew sharper, edged with salt and the scent of distant pine. On one such morning, the fog clung thick to the docks, casting the massive port into a spectral hush, broken only by the low hum of cranes and the occasional gull's cry. Ezra Callahan stood beneath the skeletal shadow of Crane 7, the steel structure arching above him like a watchtower. At 42, Ezra moved with the quiet economy of someone used to solitude. Tall, broad-shouldered, with sun-lined eyes the color of worn leather, he had the look of a man shaped by loss. His black port-issued coat hung heavily over a gray flannel shirt, his steel toe boots silent against the damp concrete. Since the death of his wife 6 years earlier, Ezra had traded the comfort of people for the rhythm of routine. His days revolved around paperwork container scans and the golden blur that now trotted faithfully beside him. Bramble was a 6-year-old golden retriever with deep amber eyes and a thick honey-colored coat that always seemed too soft for the grit of port work. He wasn't supposed to be here, at least not according to the Canine Academy that had dismissed him as too gentle. Where other dogs lunged and barked on command, Bramble hesitated. He observed. He leaned against nervous handlers and licked their hands instead of baring teeth. And yet, Ezra had chosen him without hesitation the moment he saw him at the Harbor County Rescue Shelter 2 years ago. There was something in the dog's stillness, something reflective, familiar. They walked the same circuit each morning. Ezra would murmur idle thoughts about shifts, complaints from higher-ups, or even the Oregon Ducks' latest loss, and Bramble would listen, tail swaying in slow rhythm, never interrupting, never judging. Their patrols weren't just duty, they were ritual. But today Ezra felt something shift. It began near container 12B, an unassuming steel box with rust curling around its base. Ezra scanned the manifest automatically dried medicinal herbs. Origin Vietnam. A few dozen of these arrived every week, rarely raising flags. But Bramble stopped. His body went rigid, ears slightly tilted back, tail low, but not tucked. Then he circled. Ezra paused. Something wrong, Buddy Bramble sniffed along the edge of the container, then pressed his nose to one specific corner. A soft whine escaped him, barely audible, but there. He scratched once lightly and sat back, looking up at Ezra with eyes that said, "This isn't right." It wasn't theatrical. Bramble never was. But Ezra had worked this port for 17 years. He'd seen every kind of deception, every tactic to smuggle, conceal, mislead. And he had learned painfully that sometimes a feeling was all you got before something went wrong. He radioed in for a closer inspection team, but he kept his voice measured. Possible alert at Dock 3, Container 12, Bravo. No immediate threat, but further inspection requested. While they waited, Bramble sat like a sentry, eyes fixed on the corner seam. Back at the Callahan house, an aging 2-story craftsman tucked beneath the sycamores. Nora Callahan stirred milk into tea, only to forget why she'd opened the fridge. Nora had once been the sharpest teacher at the high school, known for her fiery discussions on Walt Whitman and her cinnamon apple pies. Now, in her early 70s, her hair was white and swept into a careful bun, her frame petite but proud. She wore wool cardigans in muted colors and always kept a fresh journal near her rocking chair, though the entries lately had become more drawings than words. Earlier that week she'd left the stove on and nearly set the kitchen towel alight. Last night she'd called Ezra James and asked if he'd seen her husband. Ezra had simply nodded, hugged her, and excused himself to the porch where Bramble lay curled. "She's slipping faster," he'd whispered, fingers buried in the dog's warm fur. "And I don't know what to do, Bram. I don't." Nora's decline was a silent ache Ezra carried beneath every word he spoke. He hadn't told his supervisors. He hadn't told friends what few he still had. Only Bramble knew the full weight of it. And now here Bramble was alerting on a container like it held something more than leaves and roots. The inspection crew arrived, a pair of younger officers in neon vests and tired eyes. Ezra waved them down and explained, sparing them theatrics, but emphasizing the dog's behavior. They agreed to pull the manifest and run a scan, but one of them, Randy, a blond guy barely out of training, chuckled. Might just be some old squirrel got caught in there, or someone smuggling deer antler powder again. Ezra didn't smile. Bramble didn't move. The scan showed nothing unusual. No heat signatures, no dense metals, no erratic compositions. But Ezra watched Bramble, who had now laid down beside the container, nose still pointed at the corner. He didn't press further, not yet, but he made a note, 12B, check back tomorrow. He trusted scans, but he trusted Bramble more. That night, as the fog settled once again over Harbor Point, and the air smelled of distant fires and seaweed, Ezra sat beside his mother while she read aloud from a weathered poetry book, though she stumbled over lines, forgetting endings. "Ezra," she said quietly, mid-sentence, "when did you get so tall?" He looked at her then, at Bramble, who had curled protectively by her feet. He swallowed the ache, smiled gently, and answered, "Just recently, Ma." When she fell asleep, he stepped outside again, Bramble padding silently behind. The night was colder now, and the moon cast silver streaks across the pavement. Ezra knelt beside the dog, resting his forehead against Bramble's. "You saw something, didn't you?" "I don't know what it is, but we'll go back. We'll find it." Bramble didn't move. He didn't need to. The stillness was his answer. The next morning arrived muted and gray, the Oregon coastline buried beneath another thick veil of fog. Ezra Callahan stood again at Dock 3, the air damp against his skin, briny and cold. Bramble was at his side, calm but alert, his gaze fixed once more on container 12B. The manifest still read the same: dried medicinal herbs, assorted roots and barks. Origin, Southeast Asia. But Ezra had learned long ago that paperwork lied more often than people did. A dark SUV pulled up along the gravel edge of the dock. From it stepped Agent Sawyer Dempsey, Internal Cargo Investigations. Mid-50s, weathered with a hawkish gaze, and a head of thick silver hair slicked straight back. He wore a slate wool coat and carried himself with the tired energy of a man who'd seen too many truths hidden behind steel doors. Ezra had only worked with him twice before, enough to know the man didn't like wasting time. Callahan Dempsey said, voice gravel-lined, not unkind, but clipped. "You sure about this container?" Ezra gave a slow nod. "It's not just me, it's the dog." He flagged it twice. Same spot, same intensity. Dempsey glanced down at Bramble, who sat composed, head slightly tilted, tail unmoving. "Golden, huh?" he murmured. "They usually make therapy dogs." Ezra didn't answer. He just looked back at the container. Dempsey signaled the team behind him. 3 men and a woman in gray port uniforms moved to unlock the latches. The woman, Jules Ramirez, was new to Ezra. Young, wiry, with her dark curls pulled back into a tight bun and a face that rarely gave anything away. She worked with quiet precision, glancing only once toward Bramble before focusing on the seal. Ezra noted the slight tremor in her hands. Nervous or cold? The latches clanked open with reluctance. As the steel doors creaked apart, a wave of air rolled out, thick, musty metallic. Ezra stepped back instinctively, nostrils flaring. It wasn't the smell of herbs. Bramble let out a low whine. Inside were dozens of burlap sacks stacked with uncanny neatness, labels printed in Mandarin and Vietnamese. At first glance, they could have been anything: rice bark, dried roots. But Ezra saw the subtle sheen on the edges of some open sacks, like fish scales, but larger, duller, older. Jesus Dempsey muttered, pulling on gloves. He reached into the closest sack and pulled out a handful of curved, hard, yellow-brown plates. Pangolin scales. Jules froze for a beat before recovering. "That's endangered species trafficking," she said quietly. And Federal Time Dempsey added, "Lots of it." Bramble moved inside without needing a command nose, skimming along the ground with silent focus. He stopped near the third row of sacks and began nudging one bag in particular with his nose, then sitting in a tight curl beside it, ears forward. Ezra stepped beside him. "Let's pull this one," Ezra said. They dragged the sack aside, cutting carefully through the stitching. Inside, buried under layers of scales, were several waterproof plastic sleeves. Dempsey slit one open with a penknife, revealing laminated documents, ledgers, shipping routes, and most telling of all, a printed list of names beside transaction amounts, some marked with red ink. Ezra squatted beside Bramble and gently rubbed behind his ear. "You were right," he murmured. Jules held up a folded paper, her brow furrowed. "These names, they're coded. But some look familiar. International supplier networks, maybe. A few of these show up in older flagged manifests." Dempsey looked grim. "This isn't just a shipment. It's a map, a whole system." They sealed the area, called in Federal Wildlife Enforcement, and began logging each document and sack. As the process stretched into late evening, Ezra's phone buzzed once then again. It was the neighbor Harriet Gold, a sprightly woman in her late 60s who lived 2 doors down and kept her eyes on every movement in their cul-de-sac. Her voice was panicked. "Ezra, I think your mother left the house." She didn't answer when I knocked and the back doors wide open. Ezra felt the chill rush through him faster than the ocean breeze. "I'm on my way." He didn't stop to explain. Bramble sensed it the moment Ezra turned. The dog was already by the truck before Ezra even reached it. They arrived home to find the porch light still on the door ajar. Ezra called out, checked every room, but the silence was heavy. On the coat rack, Nora's shawl was missing, but her slippers were still there. Then Bramble darted to the kitchen, sniffed the edge of the counter where her wool scarf usually lay. He gave a short bark, then trotted to the back porch, nose to the ground. "Go," Ezra said, voice tight. "Find her." They followed the faint trail past the backyard through a narrow path that led to the state park's edge. The trees were thick, the fog thicker. Ezra moved fast, but careful flashlight beam jittering against tree trunks and brush. Bramble didn't hesitate. He veered left at a fork in the trail, pushing through low ferns and wet leaves. Ezra's boots sank into soft moss and mud. The cold was bone deep now. Then he saw her. Nora sat on a moss-covered rock near the creek, her cardigan damp, her hair loose from its bun. She looked up at Ezra, eyes wide, confused. "James?" she asked softly. Ezra dropped to his knees beside her. "No, Ma, it's me. It's Ezra." She blinked. "I was looking for the house, the old one, the one with the lilacs." Ezra wrapped his arms around her, held her close, as Bramble pressed against her legs. She reached down instinctively, burying her fingers in the dog's fur. "Warm," she whispered. They sat there in the fog just for a moment, letting the stillness settle. Then Ezra helped her to her feet. Bramble led the way back slow and steady, as if guarding something far more fragile than gold. The warehouse stood on the edge of the Harbor Point industrial zone, nestled between a derelict fish cannery and a shipping container depot whose only sign of life came from flickering overhead lights. From the outside, the warehouse appeared as unremarkable as any of the dozen others lining the district, a gray slab of corrugated steel and concrete with grime-blackened windows and a crooked surveillance camera that had long since stopped turning. But inside, Ezra Callahan knew something very different was happening. 3 days had passed since the discovery of the pangolin scales in container 12B. Federal wildlife task forces had descended on the port, combing through every detail of the shipment. Among the recovered documents was a partial delivery route ending at a facility listed under the name Northwest Storage Co., an address that matched this exact warehouse. Now, Ezra sat behind the wheel of a rusted-out white panel van, its windshield filmed with mist. Parked in a shadowed alley directly across from the warehouse loading dock, the vehicle was one of several used for port deliveries and had been hastily recommissioned for stakeout duty. In the passenger seat, Bramble lay still, his head resting on Ezra's thigh, eyes alert but calm. Ezra wore the same worn field jacket he'd had for years, his stubble thicker now from nights without proper sleep. He nursed a half-cold thermos of coffee while scribbling observations in a battered notepad. Each night brought a little more clarity to the puzzle patterns of delivery. Trucks, guards, changing positions, crates moved in and out under darkness. But tonight was different. There was tension in the air. Bramble felt it too. Ezra could tell by the occasional flick of his ear or the sudden rise and fall of his chest. At 10:17 p.m., a dark black SUV pulled up to the loading dock, its headlights off. Ezra leaned forward, lifting his binoculars. 2 men emerged, both tall, one bald, the other with long gray-blonde hair tied back in a ponytail. The bald man had a pronounced limp and leaned on a sleek black cane, despite appearing no older than 40. They were met by a third figure, a shorter man with a clipboard and jittery movements who seemed to bow slightly as he handed over a thick folder. Bramble shifted, rising onto his haunches. "Easy," Ezra murmured. He made a note. 3 suspects, delivery folder, no visible markings. High-end vehicle, no plates. He tapped his earpiece. "This is Callahan, activity at Northwest Storage. 3 males, could be the buyers." Copy that, came the voice of Agent Lynn Ford, the stakeout supervisor overseeing the larger surveillance effort. Ford was a former Air Force investigator, lean and quiet, with eyes like steel wire, and a voice that never rose above a calm monotone. She was posted in a vehicle 2 blocks down, watching the other side of the warehouse. Inside the van, Bramble stood now, front paws on the dashboard, nose barely tapping the glass. He made no sound, but Ezra saw it. His eyes had locked on something deeper in the warehouse. The dog's breathing slowed, and then the first animal cry cut through the night. It was soft, muffled by walls and distance, but unmistakable. A churring wail, the kind Ezra had only heard once before, when a documentary on pangolins played in the background during a debriefing. He turned to Bramble. The dog was still eyes focused, tail rigid. There was no doubt. They were keeping animals inside. "Confirm audio," Ezra whispered. "Leave specimens inside the warehouse. Repeat, live animals heard." Ford's voice came back immediately. "Understood. Maintain position. Federal Wildlife Team mobilizing. 20-minute ETA." Ezra felt a pang of helplessness as he watched another crate disappear behind the warehouse door. They were preparing for something. A showcase. A live demonstration. "Not tonight," he said under his breath. "You don't get away with it tonight." 15 minutes later, a knock on the van's side door made Ezra jump. He turned quickly but relaxed as he saw a familiar face, Dr. Marley Quinn. Marley was in her mid-30s, average height, but with a compact, athletic frame. Her long auburn hair was pulled into a messy braid beneath a gray beanie, and her sharp green eyes held both warmth and intensity. She wore a thick fleece jacket layered over medical scrubs and carried a leather satchel slung across her shoulder. Ezra opened the door to let her in. "Agent Ford sent me," she said, her breath fogging in the cold air. "They want a vet assessment on site in case any live animals are recovered tonight." Bramble immediately perked up. He knew Marley from the port animal wellness checks, and he trotted over to greet her tail wagging low. "Hey, golden boy," Marley said softly, crouching to rub his chest. "Still smarter than most people I know." Ezra watched her for a moment, then asked, "Do pangolins usually vocalize like that?" Marley stood frowning, only when they're stressed or hurt, and never around unfamiliar predators. If he heard them through a wall and they still cried out, they're terrified. Bramble returned to the window. His breathing was shallow again. Ezra noticed. "Marley," he said quietly, "have you ever seen a dog react like this? It's not just scent work, it's like he feels what they feel." She didn't laugh, she didn't dismiss it. Instead, she lowered her voice. "There's a growing theory in animal behavior circles some dogs, especially those with trauma or high empathy, pick up on bioemotional cues: pain, fear. Bramble may not just be detecting the presence of animals. He might be resonating with them." Ezra looked at his partner sitting still and steady in the fog-lit van. For the first time, he didn't think the idea was far-fetched at all. Just then, Ford's voice crackled again. "Team is in position, preparing breach plan." "We go at dawn," Ezra sighed. "That gives them hours. We can't risk spooking them," Ford answered. "Too many exits, too many chances they run with the animals." Ezra looked at Bramble, whose eyes hadn't moved from the warehouse since the first cry. "We wait," he said. But not quietly. The sky over Harbor Point cracked open just after 5:00 a.m., streaks of lavender and ash stretching above the steel bones of the industrial district. The fog had lifted only slightly, but the air was sharp with anticipation. It was the kind of cold that made every breath feel too loud, every movement too fast. And in that stillness, waiting in the pre-dawn dark, Ezra Callahan felt his pulse beat to the rhythm of inevitability. From their hidden position across the street, Ezra watched as the tactical unit moved like shadows. Clad in matte black gear with night vision visors flipped up, they clustered in groups of 3, taking positions around the perimeter of the warehouse. Bramble, beside him in the van, stood alert, but silent eyes trained on the warehouse doors. Ezra could feel the heat of him through his jacket, the quiet tension vibrating off the dog like a low hum. Agent Lynn Ford's voice crackled softly in his earpiece. "Callahan, we go on your mark. Let the dog lead." Ezra exhaled slowly. "Copy that." Moving in. He pushed open the van door. Bramble jumped down, first landing with the silent grace only working dogs possess. Ezra followed, cross-checking the gear strapped to his belt. No gun, he wasn't tactical today, just a handler. But he had Bramble, and that counted for more than bullets. As they approached the warehouse entrance, 2 agents, Ramsey and Tiller, covered the flanks. Ramsey was a broad-shouldered former Marine with a shaved head and a voice so low it barely registered. Tiller was smaller, wiry, with pale freckles across his face and a restlessness to every move he made. Both nodded to Ezra as he passed. The lock on the main roll-up door was already disengaged. Ezra gave Bramble a quiet nod. "Go find," he whispered. Bramble didn't need to be told twice. He lowered his head and stepped forward into the darkened corridor of the warehouse. The air inside was thick with dust and old metal. Ezra followed close behind. Flashlight angled downward, letting Bramble guide the way. The warehouse opened like a cavern. Rows of crates and equipment cast long shadows under sparse ceiling lights. The dog led them past the stacked display crates and into a narrower hallway toward the back. There, behind what looked like a wall of tool racks and maintenance lockers, Bramble stopped. His ears pricked. He pawed lightly at the floor, then turned to look at Ezra with that same insistent gaze he'd given at the container days ago. Ezra knelt, running a hand along the wall, there a slight seam. He pressed his shoulder against it, and the false wall gave way with a faint groan. Inside was a short flight of stairs leading down to a hidden room faintly lit by battery-powered lanterns. The air hit different here, warmer, fouler. And then came the sound a chittering, desperate, rasping cry. Ezra descended first. Bramble was already a head-tail, rigid, but low, his body language shifting from alert to cautious. When Ezra reached the floor, what he saw stopped him cold. A narrow room with metal shelves, crates repurposed as cages, and inside 4 pangolins. Their scales dulled by stress, their eyes glossy and too wide, they huddled against each other in corners of the enclosures. They weren't moving much, conserving energy, perhaps, but they were alive. 2 of them were small juveniles. One larger female had a swollen limb, likely fractured and left untreated. The last was a medium-sized male who, unlike the others, didn't shrink away when Bramble approached the cage. Instead, he lifted his snout and made a soft clicking sound. Subject located, Ezra called in. 4 live animals. We need a medical team down here. He opened his pack and offered the male pangolin a bit of soft cloth, Nora's old handkerchief, which he always carried in case Bramble needed comfort. The pangolin pressed its snout to the fabric briefly, then kept its eyes on Bramble. Within minutes, Dr. Marley Quinn arrived, breathless but focused. She crouched beside Ezra, eyes scanning the room like a battlefield medic. God, she whispered. They're half-starved, but that one, she nodded toward the male, he's alert. He's not scared. Bramble sat quietly beside her posture, relaxed head tilted. The pangolin moved toward him again, stopping just shy of the cage wall. It was deliberate, slow, trusting. Marley looked at Ezra, her eyes lit with something like awe. They don't do that, not to dogs, not ever. Ezra barely breathed. What's he doing recognizing him? She said. Somehow he knows Bramble helped. A quiet moment passed between them as the pangolin stood on its hind legs, front paws resting on the metal grate. Bramble mirrored the posture, nose against the bars, unmoving. Marley gave a gentle smile. He needs a name. Ezra looked at her. You name him, she thought for a moment. Finn, it means small flame. Feels right. The team began to process the room. Tillard discovered a panel in the floorboards. Beneath it, more than anyone expected, 3 USB drives, several thick notebooks, hand-drawn maps, and most damning video footage on a portable hard drive showing the brutal trapping and transportation of pangolins. Everything recorded. Everything cataloged. Ramsey held up a USB. This is the jackpot, he muttered. They filmed it all. They were going to sell more than animals. They were selling access. By sunrise, the entire warehouse had been cordoned. The animals were carefully removed from their cages and placed into recovery containers prepared by Marley and her team. Finn, unlike the others, refused to stay hidden. He kept crawling toward Bramble's scent, and when Marley finally let him nest in a padded travel box beside the Golden Retrievers station, he curled up peacefully. Ezra watched the dog and the pangolin breathe in tandem. That's not just instinct, he said quietly. That's something else. Marley nodded. Whatever it is, it saved lives. Outside, the sky turned gold, and the fog began to burn away. 1 year had passed since the raid. The old warehouse at the edge of Harbor Point no longer stood as a monument to cruelty and silence. Its rusted siding had been replaced with warm timber paneling, the sharp scent of sawdust and varnish still clinging faintly to the walls. Inside, large windows now flooded the once dark space with morning light. Where crates once concealed illegal lives, there were now murals of rainforest habitats, interactive exhibits, and the hum of schoolchildren asking wide-eyed questions. The Harbor Point Center for Wildlife Education had opened that spring, built on seized assets and federal funding born from a case that shook international smuggling rings. At the entrance stood a bronze statue, life-sized gleaming of a golden retriever, in a seated pose, head tilted with a quiet awareness. His name was etched at the base: Bramble, the dog who saw beyond smell. Ezra Callahan stood just beyond the statue watching a tour group enter. He was no longer in uniform. The field jacket had been retired, though he still wore his same worn boots and flannel shirts. A bit more gray threaded his temples now, and his shoulders seemed less rigid than a year ago. He had taken early retirement after the case wrapped, not because he was forced to, but because he felt something inside had settled. Justice had been done, and new work was calling. He now served as a canine behavior consultant and mentor at the center, training young handlers and evaluating potential working dogs from local shelters. Bramble, of course, had never left his side. Bramble remained unchanged in spirit. His golden coat was beginning to pale at the muzzle, and he took more naps than before, but his focus, especially around other dogs, was as sharp as ever. Ezra had watched him with awe as he walked the training field beside recruits, always gravitating toward the ones who hung back the shy ones, the ones that didn't bark first or wag too quickly. He would lie down beside them, place a paw gently atop theirs, and look straight into their eyes. Somehow, they always responded. One such recruit was Olive, a 2-year-old chocolate Labrador with enormous amber eyes and a history of trauma. Thin and anxious, she'd been deemed unsuitable for service by 2 separate departments. But Bramble had found her curled in the corner of the evaluation pen, and now, 2 months into training, she followed him like a shadow. When Ezra gave her a search command, she looked not to him but to Bramble for reassurance. Ezra leaned on the wooden railing of the observation deck as the school group wandered into the next hall. They were being led by Renee Tucker, the center's educational coordinator. Renee was in her early 40s, tall and composed with sun-browned skin and a quick smile. She had once been a wildlife documentarian until a close call in Sumatra, trapped during a landslide, had left her with a limp and a slower pace of life. But her passion for animal stories had only grown deeper, and she told them now to children instead of cameras. And here, she said, leading the group toward a glass enclosure with soft earth and ferns, is our most unique ambassador. Inside the habitat, Finn, the rescued pangolin, emerged from behind a small stone den. Fully recovered, his scales now bore a healthy sheen, and his movements were confident, curious. He ambled slowly toward the viewing glass as the children gasped. Finn was rescued from an illegal trade ring, Renee explained. But what makes him special isn't just survival, it's connection. He's formed a bond with one of our retired working dogs, and their story reminds us that empathy exists far beyond our species. Ezra smiled faintly as he watched the kids press closer to the glass. Every Tuesday morning, Bramble visited the habitat. Not out of duty, but because he wanted to. The first time Finn saw him through the enclosure window, he stood upright and placed his tiny claws against the glass. Bramble, mirroring the gesture, pressed his paw gently against it. It became their ritual. They didn't touch, they didn't speak, but something passed between them, quiet understanding. Ezra never interrupted it. Later that afternoon, Ezra led a session in the training yard. A group of 4 dogs, 2 German shepherds, a Belgian Malinois, and Olive were working scent puzzles. Bramble watched from a shaded bench, tail twitching gently, his eyes focused but peaceful. Afterward, Ezra knelt beside him, brushing a few leaves from the dog's fur. "You still keeping an eye on the quiet ones." Bramble licked his hand once, then rested his head on Ezra's knee. That evening, as the center's staff gathered for their monthly debrief, Director Thomas Greer joined them, a tall, bespectacled man in his 60s, with a gentle manner and a habit of stroking his beard while listening. A former federal wildlife prosecutor, Greer had overseen the conversion of the warehouse into the educational facility. "Numbers are good," he said, as the staff reviewed attendance and outreach. "But the impact can't just be measured in charts. It's in the letters from kids, the volunteers. We inspire the officers we retrain. And frankly, it's in the way Bramble still shows up every day like it's his first." Marley Quinn, seated across the room with a mug of herbal tea, nodded. She had transitioned to full-time veterinary support at the center, and now oversaw the medical care of all the rescued animals. "I think he understands it better than we do," she said. Later that night, Ezra and Bramble walked the path behind the building toward Finn's habitat. The stars above were brilliant, unmarred by city lights. A light wind carried the scent of cedar and sea. As they approached the window, Finn stirred in his den. He rose, shuffled forward, and touched his snout to the glass. Bramble stepped close, placed a paw beside the spot, and stood still. They stayed like that for a long time. Ezra watched from a distance, arms crossed against the chill. "You're not done watching over the world, are you?" he whispered. And Bramble, though motionless, answered in silence. "Sometimes the most extraordinary guardians don't wear badges or speak our language. Sometimes they walk on 4 legs with hearts so gentle that the world once dismissed them as too soft." But Bramble proved what heaven often whispers, that compassion is not weakness, and the quietest among us can carry the greatest purpose. In Finn's eyes and Bramble's silence, we see a glimpse of grace, a reminder that miracles don't always come with thunder or fire. Sometimes they arrive in the bond between a dog and a pangolin, in the hand that reaches out, instead of turning away, in the one who chooses to protect, even when no one is watching. Perhaps it was more than chance that led Bramble to that container. Perhaps, just perhaps, it was something greater, a nudge from above, a whisper from God reminding us that even in the darkest corners of our world, light still finds a way through. If this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Comment below what part moved you the most. Type Amen if you believe in silent miracles and the power of kindness. And if you haven't already subscribed to our channel for more stories that prove hope is real, love is strong, and sometimes the smallest lives are the ones heaven holds closest. May God bless you and everyone who chooses compassion.